Thank you for your patience. A special dialogue on the energy transition shall now commence. First, I would like to introduce the moderator of this session, Mr. David Sandalow. Mr. David Sandalow is ICEF Steering Committee, Inaugural Fellow for Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University, Co-Director of Energy and Environmental Concentration, School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University. I would like to ask Mr. Sandalow to moderate this session. Mr. Sandalow, if you please.
Thank you very much. I am very excited about this session. We have three extraordinary talents and unbelievable experts on the topic of the energy transition with us here. They really need no introduction, but let me do it anyway. Vaclav Smil is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Manitoba. He's a member of the ICEF Steering Committee. Vaclav is the author of more than 50 books, including relevant to today's topic, Energy and Civilization, and many other books about the energy transition, and most recently, How the World Really Works, which I believe is out in paperback, and I recommend. Michael Liebreich, who is with us joining on the screen, Chairman and CEO of Liebreich Associates. Michael is the founder of New Energy Finance, which he was the chair and CEO of until he sold it to Bloomberg in 2009. Michael has served on the Board of Transport of London, many important advisory boards for the UN Secretary General, for the World Economic Forum, and other organizations. I highly recommend Michael's podcast, Cleaning Up, which has got regular deep insights on the energy transition and other related topics. And then Ismail Serageldin, Emeritus Librarian of Alexandria, former Vice President of the World Bank, co-chair of the board of Nizami Ganjazi International Center, also a member of the ICEF Steering Committee, written remarkably widely, and I found this amazing in your bio, Ismail, recipient of more than 40 honorary doctorates in universities around the world. So we have an incredible threesome here to talk about the energy transition, and we're going to start with Vaclav, and then go to Michael, and then go to Ismail, and then have a dialogue. Vaclav, the floor is yours.
Thank you. For some 60 years, I used to lecture for a living, so I know that this is the most dreaded thing, 10 minutes. This is too long to tell a joke, and too short to give a lecture. For good reason, the university lecture is 45 to 50 minutes to lay out the topic, to develop it, whatever. So 10 minutes. I will just limit myself to numbers. I was struck yesterday listening to what people are talking about, that I had yesterday like 2 numbers, maybe 3 numbers. But this is all about numbers and all about magnitudes. And unfortunately, most people do not have the intimate relationship with 10 to 15, 10 to 18, 10 to 21. But this is what we are talking about, energy transitions. We are talking about not only just millions and billions, we are talking about quadrillions, quintillions, petawatt hours, 10 to 15. By the way, does somebody know how much electricity we produce around the world annually? Do I see some hands up? It's 27 petawatt hours, 27 to 10 to 15 watt hours, right? So if you deal with numbers like that, it's just easy to understand that numbers like that cannot be turned around, abolished, walked away from in a matter of week or months or a year. So that thing alone guarantees that what we call the energy transition. Also, this is nothing new. We've been always transiting from wood, then to charcoal. Charcoal is a better way because it's smokeless, and then to coal, and then to oil, then to natural gas. Meanwhile, we got hydro and nuclear. So there is nothing new about energy transition. The economic development always rests on some form of energy transition or another. But the magnitudes which we have developed over the past 150 years are something totally different. And if you would have this intelligent extraterrestrial Martian coming here and looking at this planet and would understand everything about its climate and about its energy, he would notice, of course, one thing. He would hear these people in the background talking about decarbonization, decarbonization. And he would notice there has been absolutely zero decarbonization on this planet, absolutely zero. Let's forget about 250 years ago when it all started, roughly. But let's go just 25 years ago. When was this first COP meeting? And that was in Berlin in 1995. So let's take it as a beginning of the global deep interest in decarbonization. First COP meeting, 1995. 2022, the last period for which we have reliable data, so it's 27 years. In past 27 years, the total emissions, the annual emissions of carbon into the atmosphere have risen by 60%. So we've gone up 60% in 27 years. As a result, atmospheric concentration, tropospheric concentration of CO2 have gone from 360 ppm to about 420 plus ppm. It will be 425 at the end of the year. We measure it extremely accurately. Okay? So there has been no absolute decarbonization, and that's the one to which the climate responds, right? Not to relative decarbonization. There has been a little bit of a relative decarbonization. In the last 27 years, we've gone from 87% carbon in terms of primary energy production in the world to about 82% carbon. So we've gone down 5% in relative decarbonization, but we've gone up 60% in absolute carbonization. So we've been running into carbon, not away from it, right? Now we are told that in the next 27 years, between 2024 and 2050, we'll go from zero to zero, right? So after we've done 60% in past 27 years. This strains my imagination, but apparently some people have no problem with it, that we'll go to zero. The problem is that going to zero is not one thing. It's not doing, just replacing internal combustion engines by electric vehicles. It's not replacing household heating, natural gas furnaces by whatever. There are many options now. It's doing all kinds of things. It's doing actually everything. Energy transition is not a, moving from A to B or from gadget A to gadget B. It's changing the whole world around. Everything has to change. The way we fly, the way we grow our food, the way we heat air condition our houses, the way we produce what I call the 4 pillars of modern civilization. That is cement, steel, ammonia, and plastics. All of these things will have to change, and will have to change fundamentally. Let me give you just one recent example how difficult it will be. Steel is the most essential metal of modern civilization. This building wouldn't exist, no rapid train would exist, no plane would exist. Steel is the fundamental metal. We are making close to 2 billion tons of it. There is 2 to 10 to 9 tons of it. About 1/3 of it is the recycled steel. So this is easy. You can electrify it because it's already electrified. You gather the old steel, you dump it into electric arc furnace, you fire the furnace, you smelt it, and got a new steel. But 2/3 of it are the primary steel, which we make from iron, ore. How do you reduce that iron ore? Well, we've been reducing this carbon since about 1760, using coke made from coal. Of course, you can reduce it also by hydrogen. When you reduce it by carbon, you get CO2 out. When you reduce it by hydrogen, you get water out. Now, how do you reduce, right now it's about 1.3 billion tons of steel. How do you replace it by green steel made by reducing carbon? In the first place, if you do your equation, adding up that iron ore, Fe2O3 plus your H2, you will need by 2050 something on the order maybe like 120 million tons of green hydrogen. Right now, we are producing 300,000 tons of green hydrogen. So just for the steel alone, you have to go from 300,000 tons to 120 million tons. Now, the Swedes, they have a long tradition of producing steel. Swedes have announced a couple of years ago that by 2026, they will have the first green steel plant. That green steel plant will produce 100,000 tons a year by 2026, Maybe, right? It's not guaranteed, but say it will, 100,000 tons. So what we need in order to produce close to 2 billion tons of green steel by 2050, we need 20,000 such plants as the Swedes will put in process in 2026. Think of it, 20,000 of them. Who is going to build all of them? Plus, who is going to build all of these 1.5 billion electric vehicles? So far, we have about 22, 25 million as I speak. We may have like 70 to 80 million by 2025, but we need 1.5 billion of them. So in 1.5 billion of vehicles, we need nearly 2 billion tons of green steel. We need more than 4 billion tons of green cement. We need more than 300 million tons of green plastics. We need 200 million tons of green ammonia, again made from green hydrogen. Right? Plus, we will need all that heating to change, all that air conditioning to change, and all that travel to change. When people talk about, I'll give you one last detailed example about the needs, how everything is connected. You want to have electric car, you want to electrify everything. Well, you will need lots of copper. If you know the basic electric engineering, there's lots of copper winding, right? Number one maker of copper in the world, producer, is still Chile, and will remain for a long time. As we mine, the quality of ores always is declining, right? The Chilean ore used to be 2%. 1.5%. Now the average Chilean ore is 0.6% copper, which means that you have to go there, you have to drill the rock, you have to blast it, you have to remove it, excavate it, and for every 1 ton of copper you get out, you get 99.4 tons of rock which you have to throw away, but you have to spend energy using processing. When you are done with it, you take that concentrate and you put it on the some of the largest ships in the world, more than 100,000 tons, powered by some of the largest diesel engines in the world, 60 to 90 megawatt giant diesel engines, to take that ore into China for processing, where it's processed and then transported around the world. Again, the scale of the enterprise is not something which could be replaced in 5 years or 10 years. So this is like all past energy transition. This one too shall last for a very long time. Let's not forget that as I speak right now, more than 1 billion people have not even accomplished or haven't even started the transition from wood to something else. There's about 1.5 billion people in the world who are burning wood and who are burning charcoal. So even that energy transition, which started 250 years ago, is not done yet. So I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Vaclav, there are about a dozen questions. Please. That is a very sobering assessment of the scale of the challenge, and there are about a dozen questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to control myself and wait and turn it over to Michael Liebreich. Michael, what's your perspective on this? Let's see, we don't have sound, actually. I don't know if you can hear us. Can we get...
That should work now.
There we go. Now we got sound. Thank you.
Hello, David, and hello, everybody. It's an enormous honor to be back speaking to ICEF. And Vaclav has laid out with great eloquence and fantastic data exactly why a transition is incredibly difficult. And I'm not going to disagree that it is going to take many, many decades. And if you want me to sit here and say, oh, don't worry, we can do this by 2050, I'm afraid I can't do that. But what I will do, and if I can share my screen, then hopefully I'll be able to show at least some good news and some optimism and why we might be able to achieve at least a transition at some point, although probably not fast enough. Now, I need to...
Yep, we've got it.
Can everybody see can you see my slide there?
Yep, we have it, Michael. We see it.
Very good, very good. Okay, so as I say, I have spoken to ICEF before. It was in 2017, and I'll use this as my starting point. In that speech, I commented that we had these years of very rapid growth in mainly renewables, but that it had stalled, and that we had seen 6 or 7 years of the revenue of the investment not growing, and this was all about renewable energy. Very exciting. It's a very small part of the transition, as we'll see, but it was growing fast, and then it stalled. It stalled partly because the costs were coming down so fast that the volume of installations of wind and solar and other renewables were increasing, but the dollars flowing were not. So since then, we saw more years of that kind of great hiatus, and then more recently, it started to take off. And so if you look at where we are in history, we've seen this incredible price spike. So coming out of COVID, supply chains fractured, we've got an inflationary spike driven by interest rates, and of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That spike is now receding, and what it's being replaced by is the great clean energy acceleration. Now, it's not just me saying this. It is also Fatih Birol. He's the most eminent energy economist in the world, the head of the IEA, International Energy Agency. And what he says is the world is set to add as much renewable power in the next 5 years as it did in the previous 20. And I know that Vaclav at this point will be trying to jump out of his seat saying, but it's only 4 or 5% of primary energy, and we'll come back to talk about that. But if you look at it visually, this is electricity, right? And electricity is only about 20, just slightly over, somewhat over 20% now of the energy used in the world. But nevertheless, you can see this really powerful substitution curve happening there, where the green line is the modern renewables. The blue line there, you can see also hydro. And you see also on this slide, nuclear, which as a percentage of global electricity is falling away. And that substitution curve has reached a point where wind and solar is today accounting for about 15% of global electricity from very low figures 20 years ago, figures of around 1%. And it's very disruptive because it has no marginal cost, and it appears when the wind blows and the sun shines, not necessarily when we need it. And so we get all sorts of odd things happening in the power markets. It's extremely disruptive. The price formation mechanism is being disrupted. Now, this is a real change to energy economics in many, many ways, because fundamentally these are manufactured technologies. This is not resource economics, as Vaclav would have learned back in the day when he was a student and that he's taught for many years. This is now the economics that's much more associated with things like flat screen TVs and cars. And even when you start to apply software, you get software type economics. And so we can look at these doublings. And in the last 22 years, we've seen 6 doublings in wind capacity and 9 doublings in solar capacity. And the doublings is what pushes down the cost, relentlessly pushes down the cost. The same way that flat screen TVs got cheaper, the same way that cars got cheaper. And in fact, in some ways, the same way that your mobile phone or your software actually got cheaper. And so these are the forces that are pushing down the costs of the clean solutions. Just an aside on nuclear, for those who think the answer is nuclear, I could go into a long conversation, we may talk about it later, on the cost of nuclear, the cost overruns of nuclear, but there's also just a fundamental speed problem with nuclear. So you look at 3 countries trying to build nuclear in blue, and in purple you see renewables, and this is not capacity, this is generation, enormously outgrowing nuclear. And it doesn't take a genius to know that those curves, those lines curving up like that, are likely to continue to do more of the same. Now, this causes enormous problems. As I say, the price formation mechanism, which used to be the marginal cost of the marginal provider of electricity, who was using gas, most likely, maybe coal. So there was a positive electricity price. We now see the electricity prices going negative more and more often. And it's extremely disruptive. Of course, the answer to this is some storage, but batteries, the scale of batteries, Vaclav has told us scale matters. The scale of batteries will never be enough to power the world through these longer duration power outages. Right now, if you go to, let's say, an evening where the sun goes in and everybody gets home and starts using their appliances, the solution is the gas peaking plant. That's the preferred solution. But what is creeping up on the gas peaking plant for those few hours of outage is batteries. They're becoming cheaper than gas peaking plants around the world. But we also have secret weapons, and 2 very specific, which is the electric car and electric heating and in fact cooling as well. But electric heating, because the heat load, the cooling load can of course be electrified because it tends to happen in places where it's very sunny. The heating load is actually the more difficult one. Now, why do I call them secret weapons? Because of course it's much cheaper to demand response, to just flexibly charge your car, than it is to store electricity in a battery that's just used for that and that only. And it's also much cheaper to store heat than it is to store electricity. So here you can see EV sales taking off, of course, driven by this the same sort of experience curve, the same sort of doublings, the same sort of cost reductions as we saw in wind and solar. And you also see not just improvements in cost, but also in energy density and in the lifetime of batteries. It is revolutionary what's going on in batteries. Will it cover 2 weeks? No. But will we be able to get through a day using anything that happens in a day using batteries, grid connected, using flexible charging of vehicles, and also using flexible heat? The answer is absolutely yes. And here's heat pumps. You can see again one of these curves curving upwards. You don't have to be a genius to know what happens next. Now, we're also seeing incredible innovation in industrial heat. And Vaclav talked about cement. Well, cement, the emissions come partly from heating and partly from the process. The heating emissions can all go to zero as we go to clean electricity. You need these high temperature technologies, which are certainly commercializing and maturing, and you also probably need some buffering, some thermal buffering, but it's absolutely within the range of what we can do. The process emissions we probably have to capture and put underground somewhere. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about hydrogen. Hydrogen is my special subject, some of you may know. I'll talk about it a little bit, just in case there's anybody saying, hydrogen solves all these problems. And Vaclav has already started by alluding to the vast scale. If you think this is going to be solved by green hydrogen, this is the Hydrogen Society. And this is somebody I know who's read every single one of Vaclav's books, Bill Gates. I'm very proud that I think he's referring to me. He says so many people, so many potential uses. Some people refer to hydrogen as the Swiss Army knife. And of course, hydrogen can do everything. Transport, power storage, chemical feedstock, heat, everything, right? The problem is the analogy is perfect. That may have been missed by Bill Gates and others. The reason I say it's like a Swiss Army knife is that you can cut your hair with a Swiss Army knife, but you don't. And you can prune a tree with a Swiss Army knife, but you don't. And the reason is there's almost always something that is cheaper, safer, more convenient. Cheaper, safer, more convenient. And that is exactly what is going to happen to hydrogen. So battery electric vehicles are taking off around the world. Fuel cell vehicles to scale are simply not drawn to scale. And the reason is they're fundamentally worse cars. Any engineer will tell you the one on the left costs more to make. And of course, the one on the left, the hydrogen car, is enormously less efficient. If what you have is clean electricity and you want to drive somewhere, you put it in a car and you drive somewhere. And somebody really needs to tell Toyota the extent to which that is what is going to happen. It is already happening around the world. So I put together this thing called the Clean Hydrogen Ladder. At the top, the things we absolutely have to do with clean hydrogen. Vaclav has talked about them. It is fertilizer, ammonia. It is also desulfurization, etc. And we have to use clean hydrogen because it's about 2.5% of emissions if we don't. And there's some other things. And long duration storage. Now, I talked about batteries will not get you through 2 weeks and there's very low wind, or 2 weeks of a monsoon, or a cyclone, a Pacific cyclone, and so on. And that is where we may be using hydrogen for long duration storage, but it is for 3 to 5% of the year. It's not all year long importing ammonia and using it in power stations. That would drive up the cost of electricity to an absurd level. Vaclav already talked about this, the sheer scale of production. This is the largest green hydrogen project in the world in Saudi Arabia, the largest, 4 gigawatts of power, cost $8 billion, produces 0.2% of global hydrogen production. If we use green hydrogen at the top of the ladder, we're talking about that green curve I showed you growing, multiply it by 5, and use it all just to decarbonize the top of the ladder. And while you do that, don't do anything else in terms of decarbonization. No heat, no transport, no electricity. And if you want to import energy, and Japan, particularly Japan, Korea, Northern Europe, will have to continue to be vast energy importers. If you want to do it using hydrogen, it is incredibly inefficient. Forget the capital cost. We're talking about electricity prices that by definition must be 4 times the price of electricity in the source country as in the destination country, simply because of thermodynamics, not going to change by much. And how can you be competitive with an energy-intense economy when your electricity, everything is electrifying, and your electricity costs 4 times, and then add capital costs, maybe 5, 7, or even 10 times more than countries that are blessed with lots of wind and solar and geothermal and other resources. So just to conclude, you know, the model for decarbonization, and it's the only model, it's the only game in town, is really 2 things. 1, make our power clean, electricity goes clean, and 2, increase its share in final energy. It has to become the dominant, not that 20 to 25% of the energy we use, but 60, 70, 80, 90% of the energy we use, because it is the only way that we're going to decarbonize. So if you want decarbonization, decarbonize electricity and drive up the percentage. If you look at the trends, we are not on track. As Vaclav has talked about, we are not on track, but decarbonizing electricity by 2070, around 2070, is possible, but we are nowhere near on track with electricity penetrating into steel and cement and aviation and so on. More radical scenarios are possible, but we would have to take really dramatic, fast, deep action on a scale that we are not doing, and we are not even, we are simply not grasping at present.
Michael, thank you. You're getting applause in the room. I don't know if you can hear it, but you're getting applause in the room. Thank you so much, and we'll come back to the points you made. Ismail, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to pick up on 2 points. One is the fact that we have a very long time horizon based on what we've heard from both Vaclav and but what we have also is something that Dr. Smil has mentioned before, which is that there's a difference between what we're using today and what's already in the atmosphere, and that's what affects the climate most. And that the likelihood, I had a graph that I've used before in my lectures that shows, in fact, that we may well overshoot our climate target and therefore try to reduce it afterwards by negative carbon emissions or withdrawing carbon from the atmosphere. And that seems increasingly likely. Because the other aspect is that we're talking about new investments here. Everything we've heard was about new investments. But let's assume now that you have all these magnificent electric cars. Well, you still have about 1.5 billion old clunker cars in Cairo, Lagos, Delhi, Rio, and they're not going to be switched overnight. Even if the new technology is there, even if the number of cars are there. There's a phase-in period and a phase-out period that affects when the new technology really replaces the old. And that's also part of the problem with very lumpy investments in cement and so on. Plus, it was mentioned on passing here the question of transport, but there's also roads, paving roads. There's a lot of things that take up carbon-produced materials and carbon-produced energy to lay out, which is problematic. Now, I would like to submit that there is something which we can do to think about decarbonization on a large scale, and that is to transform the agriculture sector, the food and agriculture sector. Now, first of all, it's huge. It's by far the biggest consumer of water, about 70 to 80%, depending on the countries, 70% globally. It is by far the largest user of land. It affects 40% of the land surface of the earth in transforming landscapes, deforestation, et cetera, et cetera. We have many, many things. It also uses fertilizer. It's a major problem. Plus, it's terribly wasteful. There's about 30% waste. But in some very poor countries, the post-harvest losses are running 35% in places in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, the harvested food is not reaching the consumer. And in the West as well, there's a lot of wastage. Material is thrown away, the food is thrown away. So despite all of that, we have a huge problem because about 1 in 9 human beings is hungry. And our number 1 and number 2 SDGs have been talking about poverty reduction and abolition of hunger, and we've had the regressions on that in the wild. So what's that got to do with energy? Well, nature has its own carbon capture and sequestration system, and it's in the plants. The plants have enabled us to have oxygen, and they've taken away carbon, and they put it in the soil. And the scale that they can bring to a transformation of that kind is huge. Secondly, the speed at which something like that can be done is much faster than people imagine, partly because in most cases, leaving aside forests, I'll come back to those for a moment, but in most cases, you plant every year. And thus we could see the speed with which, for example, the Green Revolution occurred in India. In a few years, the old style crops were reduced, the dwarf wheats were in, the new rice was in, and as a result of that, it spread very, very, very quickly throughout the country, and the India that couldn't feed 450 million people suddenly had major caloric surplus. I say caloric surplus, not hunger abolition, but caloric surplus over 1 billion people. So it can be done quickly. And today we have tools that we didn't have before to transform the agriculture of the world into a climate-smart agriculture and a precision science agriculture, partly through the remote sensing, spectral analysis, better water, nutrient, and soil management, better soil management generally, because soil has been largely not sufficiently studied, but biologically it can do a lot more than people imagine. And also with the new biology, we now have the capacity to tweak the genes of plants in ways that we couldn't dream of before, not only to produce more yield, higher nutrition plants, et cetera, but also, for example, if you are going to be replanting forests that have been cut down before, we can have trees that will absorb twice as much CO2 as they grow from the original varieties. We can do a lot in terms of the plants and what they do. And we can also reduce the methane, which the cattle produce, by tweaking the bacteria that go into the gut of the cows, which is work that was done in UC Davis, and that proves that you can give it to the calves when they're there, and it stays with them for the rest of their lives. So there's a lot that can be done to turn a sector that is a major contributor to the problems to becoming a sector that's a major contributor to the solutions. The solutions will be needed because I believe that we will overshoot in terms of our perspective on staying within 1.5 to 2 degrees. I think we will overshoot, and we will need to bring down the cumulated carbon and methane or carbon equivalents that are in the stratosphere. And to do this, you either are going to go into geoengineering, or you're going to have a food and agricultural sector that really and truly learns to work with nature, in harmony with nature, using nature-based solutions. Then we have a whole new area which is now becoming important, I think in Japan in particular. It is the idea of seaweed. The value of seaweed being that it grows in salt water in the sea and doesn't use land, so it neither uses fresh water nor land, but is also potentially available as an output, harvested. It could be used for production of certain materials as well as production of food. And this is part of the rethinking in agriculture, which used to be, let's copy the Western US type high energy, high agricultural production, which effectively is not very efficient if you add all the negative impacts it has on the environment and on people. Then the actual cost of the production goes up from $1 trillion to closer to 2-point-something trillion. So there's a lot of hidden costs that are not factored into looking at that type of agriculture. I think we can do a lot, and this is not looking for a mystical, bucolic past, you know, where we are going to be living with nature and eating organic foods and all on. So no, I mean, I think this is a high scientific precision agriculture, but that will function very differently, both in its utilization of energy and in its capacity to use nature's systems to deal with the problems that we are causing in the planetary boundaries that we are transgressing. So, for example, just as an example, when we talk about the amount of water and so on, we have ignored the estuaries and the wetlands, which are nature's reservoirs. And if we now learn to reclaim these and integrate them into the water management systems, the freshwater management systems in this case, you start seeing that the possibilities are much greater than they used to be. And this is not just for the poor countries in the South. The United States today, almost every single groundwater aquifer is being used faster than the recharge rate. So the water tables are dropping everywhere. I mean, and this is a serious problem, and therefore you're disturbing the hydrological cycle, which in turn has a very complicated connection, not just with agriculture, but also with the climate change. So in balance, I would say that I agree with much that's been said about the energy transition, but I would think we will overshoot, and I think then we will find out the value of going back to the food and agricultural sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail. So much to talk about. I want to bring in questions and comments from the audience, but first have questions for each of our speakers. And just starting with you, Vaclav, you are a historian of energy transitions. In fact, I think you're the world's preeminent historian of energy transitions. And I wanted to ask you about the 21st century energy transition that we're in now compared to previous energy transitions. One feature of the 21st century energy transition is that it's policy driven to a very significant extent. We have more than 150 countries around the world have submitted nationally determined contributions defining what they are doing in policy to try to change the energy system, most of them. And not all of them are strong, but some of them are pretty significant. And most of the industrialized world right now has pretty significant policies to try to change the energy system. And I wondered, is there any analog to that in history? Has anything like that ever happened? And if not, do you think that this type of policy push that's happening around the world could make this energy transition different or faster than previous energy transitions?
First of all, those policy pledges, I find it interesting that the people always talk about Paris Agreement, and they have apparently didn't read to the page 4 of Paris Agreement. It says that even if all contracting parties would fulfill their obligations, their promises, the emissions of CO2 would rise to 55 billion tons from 37 billion tons by 2050. Right? So, this shows again that this is this tanker problem, right? You cannot turn the tanker on the dime, as the American saying goes. So even if all contracting parties, this is worth repeating once again, would fulfill their obligations according to Paris Agreement, emissions would rise to 55 billion from 27 billion tons, 37 billion tons. So, and countries are in different stage of development. I think, most people don't realize the gaps here. If you leave out the Emirates and Saudis and Qatar, Canada is the hog, close to 300 gigajoules per capita. America 200 gigajoules plus. EU about 140, right? China today about 115 gigajoules per capita. Britain is less than China now, right? India though is 25, and if India would do even half of China, it will go to 50, 60 gigajoules, and this is why India will do another billion tons of coal. China, by the way, this year already has approved the record number of coal-fired power plants. And most people couldn't place Guyana on the map, and they don't know where it is and what are its neighbors. But let me tell you that Guyana is now in the process to becoming a new Kuwait. They discover tremendous amount of oil, and they'll go full hog to develop it. And so does Egypt, developing natural gas. And so will Mozambique, developing natural gas. And so will Ghana and Cameroon develop crude oil. So there are countries which will go full speed because they want to go from 10 to 15 gigajoules to at least India, 25, or maybe perhaps to half of China, 60 gigajoules. So there's this tremendous gap which is driving people to do the fastest possible thing to lift themselves up, and the fastest possible thing to unleash the power of crude oil and natural gas. So it depends who is doing what kind of transition and what time scale.
I'm just going to push you a little bit more on this, because notwithstanding everything you just said, we do have a lot of countries around the world that are pushing very strongly for reduced carbon emissions, for increased renewable energy deployment. That's driving down the price of renewable power in particular, but other things. And there's a step function once renewable power and storage becomes cheaper than the alternative, which is in a number of ways, change becomes not just linear, but exponential. This is the argument. And therefore, the change can happen much more quickly than you're saying. What's your thought on that? And then I'll turn to Michael.
There is another very important aspect to it. Namely, this is a very, very divided world, and it's becoming more so. If you look at the emissions, 7 countries produce about 72% of them, or groups of countries. China, 31%, US, 14%, EU, 11%, India, 8%, Russia, 4%, and Saudi and Indonesia, about 2% each. So you have these 7 countries, and this is the reality of the world in October 2023. Can you imagine those 7 countries pulling on the decarbonization rope with the same devotion and strength for the next 27 years, up to 2050, I just can't. I just can't. Really, okay. Right? If you say that you can, well, then you live in a different world. Many of these countries don't even speak to each other right now.
Michael, I'll turn to you for any comment on that, and then I was curious as well about your thoughts about the decarbonization of heavy industry, which is something you didn't have a chance to talk about in your short presentation. And obviously, those hard-to-abate sectors are particularly challenging. What do you see there? And any thoughts on what Vaclav is saying?
Okay, so I've already said that I don't subscribe to 2050 decarbonization. I think I gave up on that years and years ago, and I think that at some point we have to have a kind of a grown-up discussion in the halls of power around the world about what does that mean, because I do think that a 2070 is achievable if we accelerate, as I talked about in my opening remarks. Some of those very difficult to decarbonize sectors, heavy industry, steel, cement, aviation, and so on, would have to really be on a different trajectory. Having said that, I do quite disagree with this idea that, oh, it's all much too hard and it's much too big and these countries are going to just do the exact same things as we. No, we have to, I don't know the statistic that Vaclav quoted from the Paris Agreement, whether that was the original NDCs in Paris at that time, but the data is that global carbon emissions have actually largely peaked, and they've been about flat for over 10 years. That's the fact. So, the narrative is, oh, they keep going up and they go up and so on. The fact, and this is Global Carbon Project data, is that they're about flat. Now, of course, they have to go to zero. And I think that I loved, Ismail's optimism, because he could have said, oh, even agriculture is so big and 40% of the world's surface and nothing could possibly change if he was in sort of Vaclav's camp. But instead, he portrayed this optimistic picture. We can do something. We have agency. And I think if you look at what's happening between the developing world and the developed world is decarbonizing, right? There's 35 countries or so that are already decarbonizing. Their carbon footprint is reducing. It's reducing per capita. It's reducing even when you take into account imports. They are reforesting. The forest cover is actually growing in large parts of the developed world. And of course, there's an issue with what happens next in these colossal countries, India or colossal continent, Africa, and so on. But the point there is, think about what happened with mobile phones. When they first came along and they were very expensive and people thought that only billionaires would use mobile phones, or multimillionaires. And then what happened is they became cheaper and suddenly working people out and about in cars and vans were the next people to take up because they provided enormous value. And now we scroll forwards and mobile phone is the cheapest new phone line. Nobody goes for a landline, not in the developed world, not in the developing world, not old people, not young people. Nobody now installs landlines. So why would you, if you are looking for electricity, first-time user of electricity, still about 600 million people, why would you not go with the solution that is cheaper, that is local, more resilient, that you install it, you need to, and yes, it won't do heavy industry, it won't do cement, or it won't do steel, but you know what? It will meet every need that you have, cooling, it will meet your needs for heating if you need it. So we're going to leapfrog in much of the developing world. We'll never do the technologies that we have used. So I am much, much more optimistic that we're over some tipping points, with the caveat that let's try and kind of bend the curve to 2070 and stop talking about 2050.
Ismail.
Yeah, I think I have an important sort of qualifier. And that this is when we talk about, okay, instead of coal, we're going to use oil, and instead of oil, we're going to use gas. And per unit of energy produced, you produce less carbon. Yes, but you're still producing carbon. And the problem is that the carbon stays up there. So you have a serious problem about where we're going to be able, or when we're going to be able to reduce I will not just go to net zero, because if you go to net zero, you still have the stock of carbon that you put up there is going to be there with you. So you have a major, major problem. Why do I say that? Because one other thing that has happened in the last few years is that many of the things that we were predicting would come further down have started happening. In terms of the heat waves, the scale of the fires, the scale of the floods and droughts that we expected would come at maybe 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 degrees. Well, they're here at 1.2 degrees. And I think that this is a serious, because of course these were estimates about what would happen. This is a serious challenge that we really have to figure out, not just how to stabilize or reduce the amount of carbon that we are producing every year, but how, in fact, to take it down, not only go to net zero, but then start taking down the stock, or else the climate problems we will face will be extremely severe.
We have a lot of talent in the audience here and a lot of expertise. I want to see if anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to add. I believe Changhua.
Hi, I'm Carl Page from the Anthropocene Institute. And
Carl.
I just suggest, why do we assume that the nuclear technology of 1965 is the best we could ever do? And why are we working so hard to prohibit any companies from building a new plant with today's economics and safety? And that could be deployed extremely rapidly. And why do we assume that can never happen?
Vaclav, Michael, or yeah, Ismail.
Well, I don't assume it's never going to happen. I assume it will happen. But we have an enormous public receptivity problem. I mean, I happen to agree with most people that it is very safe, that even Fukushima was, despite the fact that it was a tsunami and an earthquake, and did not lead into the kind of disasters that people anticipated. But there is a problem of public receptivity and opposition to allowing new nuclear plants, although it certainly would be a clean solution and a non-emitting solution.
And Michael, comment on nuclear?
Shall I come
Yep.
in?
Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
So, absolutely, I have a background in nuclear engineering, an ancient background, and so particularly with if you look at existing nuclear plants, whether that is bringing the Japanese plants back online or whether it's trying desperately to save these extraordinary, great plants in Germany, which Germany has been willfully shutting. There's no question that we should be life extending what we've got. The challenge comes when you try to build new nuclear. Ismail talked about public receptivity. I mean, that's a leadership problem, that our leaders have been absent from that kind of education function of explaining that they are, number one, essentially safe, but also that climate change, and by the way, respiratory disease issues are much, much worse if we don't do nuclear and we stick with the alternatives, which right now is a lot of fossil. But the biggest problem nuclear has is actually economics. You look at these gigawatt scale plants and around the world, not just the developed world, but the developing world as well, they go over budget and they are late. And very often the budgets, particularly in the developing world, get hidden in various places with costs of capital and all sorts of, whether it's military budget or not budgeting for decommissioning, or lots of places you can hide nuclear spending if you really want to have a nuclear program. So the big plants are very, very difficult economically, and you start to have alternatives that are cheaper. So you can have, as I said, lots of renewables with demand response and storage, and then you ask yourself, why do we need the nuclear that is problematic and will probably go over on cost and development time? You could do geothermal, which is having a renaissance. You can do, there are projects, I happen to be an investor in a project to bring very cheap clean energy from Morocco to the UK via a very substantial undersea cable. So you have these alternatives that are cheaper. Why do the difficult thing? To your point about the technologies, then people say, what about small modular reactors? Why can't we use some of Michael's doublings, the doublings that drive down the costs? And why can't we use that in nuclear? I want to give you, Vaclav started us by saying numbers matter. So one number is 2030. Right now we have no small modular reactors. We may have a few by 2030, single digit numbers, maybe not even one, frankly. If you wanted to use 100 megawatt small modular reactors, 100 megawatt, some of the models are bigger and smaller, but let's use that as a metric. If you build 100 megawatt small modular reactors, and you want to get to the point where you reach the same number of petajoules output per year as wind and solar, you would need 5,416 of them. 5,416 nuclear reactors. They have to be sited, permitted, supply chain, fueled, decommissioning planned, fuel cycle planned, protected militarily from all the bad people out there. And I just say, I have a nuclear background. Please, let's try. Let's do our best. But please, let's try with our eyes open, right? Because it's very, very hard to see it being particularly meaningful.
Okay, and so in this session, Carl started a very live topic here, so thank you for that. We have about 5 minutes. I want to bring in Ho-Sung Lee and Woo Chung-Hwa, and I know both Vaclav and Ismail want to come in on nuclear as well. So why don't we hear from Ho-Sung and Chung-Hwa, and then give each of our speakers last opportunity for comment. So can we get a microphone up front here? Thank you very much. And that way everyone can hear it.
Yes, thank you very much. I entirely agree with that. We need a grown-up discussion. Agree with that. And given that, we have just heard that rich countries reduced emissions. At the same time, we should know that other countries, not so rich, increased emissions. And there, the help needed, especially in the areas of the hard-to-abate sectors, steel, cement, chemicals, mostly produced in those regions, not so rich countries. So help, I don't have to repeat what kind of help they need. We all already know that. Now, in terms of the having a discussion in reality, respecting reality, also in terms of the informed discussion, I hard to believe the countries participating in the climate convention spent 2 or 3 years discussing phase down or phase out particular fuel, especially when we all recognize that there are a number of countries endowed with those fossil fuels. So I think that we need to have a somewhat more neutral position with regard to the technology or resources, especially when we don't know what the future course of technology will be, given the mandates, given the aspiration of the world to achieve this 1.5, hopefully, but definitely need to reduce carbon emissions as much as possible. Therefore, we have an open mind to all those technologies as long as they contribute to reducing carbon emissions. So these days, every choice, our moderator indicated that whether there was a historical analog of this pushing the particular transition path in the past as we experience, as we expect to see now, right now. Well, historically, especially now, every energy choice is the result of the aggregate of market plus government subsidy, policies, and regulations. That's the reality. It will be the case, though. So, and here we should be neutral. You should be neutral, and every country has different circumstances, and they know what will be their best choice for reducing carbon emissions. And we should welcome any technologies, any knowledge that will be contributive to reducing carbon emissions.
Thank you. Can we pass the microphone to Changwa?
Thank you. I will be more specific. I think ICEF, the DNA of ICEF is about innovation, particularly turning the challenge into an opportunity. I think that's the DNA of ICEF here. I do understand the complexity of the issues, but I do want to get down to one specific sign of hope, which is about the solar. Michael, I like your analogy about the leapfrogging. You use a mobile phone, which has been used many, many times. I've heard that many, many, many times. But today, from energy transition perspective, we have one option on the table, which is solar. So one thing we're doing now, we're launching a global campaign called Solar Lights the Planet. IEA has been suggesting like we need to triple, right, the solar installation by 2030. In China now, we're advocating 10 times that, which is 1 kilowatt per capita solar installation by 2030. You know what's happening now? Ever since we launched this campaign, China is already getting to 2 kilowatt hours there, kilowatts of solar installations there. So things like that is so cheap, it's really ready. Why are we still being stuck in the geopolitical landscape there? Why don't we just really, for the sake of humanity, somehow just open your arms, really get the solar part actually fully deployed as much as possible, not only on the energy transition, but particularly for rural and the less developed regions, there's a huge co-benefits as well as the synergy with other SDGs there. So I really want to bring that up actually as a sign of hope in terms of opportunities there. Thank you.
Oh, I wish we had 30 minutes. But instead, the sign I was just given says we have 3 minutes. So what I'm going to start with Ismail, and then go to Michael, and then go to Vaclav for the last words for any closing comments on any of the issues.
Yeah, no, I
raised.
just want one other thing. The reason I mentioned also the attitude of people was because I had meetings with Angela Merkel twice, 3 times, and I spoke to her because she's background in physics, and I said, but you know, the Eastern German nuclear reactors may be considered unsafe, but those in Western Germany are perfectly safe, so why would you close them down? And she said, we live in a democracy, and if the people in my country tell me they want one form of energy over another, I think they're entitled to it. I think that's just as...
Michael, any closing thoughts?
Yes, certainly. I think people are allowed their own, even in a democracy, people are allowed their own choice of energy, but they're not allowed their own choice of the laws of physics. I am optimistic. So the solar, why am I optimistic? Solar doublings. The fact is that primary energy, I said that we'd come back to it, we didn't. 2/3 of the current energy that we produce is wasted. Same as Ismail talked about agriculture, the same is happening in energy. There are opportunities for innovation everywhere. I am optimistic, but I'll finish. I'm optimistic for 2070 and for 2 degrees, not for 2050 and 1 degrees. 1.5 degrees, rather.
Thank you, Michael. Vaclav, you have the last word.
Isn't it very interesting about fossil fuels? Remember, people said fracking, Americans are fracking for oil and natural gas. It's a horrible crime against humanity. And then, you know, came Ukrainian war, and America saved Europe because of fracked natural gas. You know, I mean, this is an interesting place, and people tend to forget these things, right? As far as some countries decarbonizing, a few months ago, a friend of mine sent me an email saying, look at Denmark, what a success story. They cut the emissions by 50%. Yes, they don't make any steel, any ammonia, any cement, any plastics. They don't assemble any cars, and they import 20% of their electricity. So, of course, it's easy to decarbonize that way. Britain, another example, most deindustrialized industrial country in the world. Of course they decarbonize. So, you know, fossil fuels are here to stay for quite a while. I'm sorry to say so, but facts are facts.
Well, this is the 10th anniversary of ICEF. It takes a conference like ICEF to pull together such an extraordinary group of speakers. Please join me in giving them a big hand.